I think I'll just use this. Good morning. That was very good information Courtney gave. I'm from Cadgett County, and many years ago I was county auditor, and I saw I called it the tax levy roller coaster, because we had especially some townships that were getting an increase in their Cadgett certified shares, and they had this huge amount of certified shares, so they didn't need the property tax levy, and they would reduce their property tax levy down to nothing, and then following that, then they'd see their certified shares drop drastically, and then finally came to me and asked what's going on, and I said, well, you're on the tax levy roller coaster because you keep changing your levy, it affects your Cadgett, and we went through that, and some of the townships, having realized that, found a middle ground on their tax levy to keep it more stable, and so if your county is experiencing that, you want to take a look at that. And mayors and township trustees can be really interested in that, because it's not good to be running in an election in the year you had to raise your property tax levy back up, and you'll never convince the taxpayers that you're not spending any more money, your budget's the same, but your tax levy increased. You've tried to explain that to people, they'll think you are insane and you're not telling the truth. But when you are. For this morning's presentation, the handouts are, hopefully you have a copy of my presentation on circuit breaker. It's been several years since there has been a basics of circuit breaker presentation. So this is really going to be down to the basics of circuit breaker. And I know there are several auditors here who have never really seen a presentation just of the basic grassroots of what is circuit breaker and how does it work and so forth. And hopefully you'll come away from here with a better understanding of circuit breaker and how it works. There is a correction to the handout on page 3 on slide 6, where I have the circuit breaker exempt funds listed for all counties, the referendum funds. I failed to state that it's the referendum funds for 2008, 2009, and after. And so that's a change. I caught that and made that correction on my next presentation after the break, but I failed to go back and fix it on this one. So this morning, I'm on the circuit breaker. I'm going to touch upon what is circuit, just generally basic. What is circuit breaker credit, and how is it calculated, and what we mean by net tax subject to circuit breaker credit. And then a term that I invented, I call it the net assessed value threshold percentage, and explain to you what I mean by that and how that has an impact on circuit breaker credits, and that cocould be very valuable for you to know when you're trying to explain to some taxpayers who can do calculations on property taxes but not maybe see the full big picture, and when they're trying to challenge you as to that they should have a circuit breaker credit and don't, and the reason they don't may have a whole lot to do with this net assessed value threshold percentage. So hopefully that will help you there. And then discuss briefly what we mean by circuit breaker revenue loss. The circuit breaker credits occur whenever a net tax bill, and you want to underline net tax bill, are capped at a maximum amount. Net tax bill is the amount the tax bill is for the taxpayer, or also called their tax liability. And that's what's being capped at a maximum amount. In Indiana, that calculation is based on a percentage of the gross assessed value of the property. And there are 3 different cap levels at 1%, 2%, and 3% of the gross value. How the groups that are under each of those cap levels, homestead property is and now fortunately homestead property does mean homes where a taxpayer has applied and been approved a standard deduction and maybe also homestead credit. It's not just property that's eligible for that, thank goodness. And residential property, long-term care property, and agriculture property are at the 2% level. And then the 3% level is basically everything else, which is non-residential real property and personal property. So that circuit breaker credit amount, credit deduction will equal the amount that net tax bill exceeds the percentage of gross assessed value limit. So for a homestead property, the homestead is limited to 1% of the gross value, and so the amount, if any, that the net tax bill exceeds that limit, that is the circuit breaker credit deduction for homestead property. So this calculation is the same for each of the 3 different types of property. It's a calculation of the net tax bill, and you compare that to the percentage of the gross assessed value, and whatever the amount the net tax bill exceeds that, then that is the credit deduction that the taxpayer will receive, and their tax bill will not be greater than that percentage of the gross value. And so that deduction is applied automatically with the tax calculation to reduce the net tax bill down to the limit. If a property has more than one of those types, then the calculation that is occurring on the tax bill for the credit, the circuit breaker credit, it has to occur for each of the types separately, and then the sum of those becomes the total circuit breaker credit for the tax bill. And in the example I'm going to go through here in a moment, I have a tax bill that has all 3 types, and we'll look at how that works. There's another little twist to circuit breaker, and that has to do with the fact that the state legislature has identified certain funds to be excluded from the circuit breaker credit calculation. And so these are circuit breaker credit exempt funds. And here is where hopefully you've made a note, because my slide's updated, but you've made a note that for all counties, that one of those fund types are referendum funds, but it's only referendum funds that have been established in 2009 and after. For Lake and St. Joseph County, their debt service and lease rental funds for debt and leases issued or entered into before July 1, 2008, those funds are exempt from circuit breaker credit. And then now, starting next year, that is going to include any refunding or amending of those debt or leases that were issued before July 1 of 2008. So those funds and the tax rate for those circuit breaker exempt funds, they're not included in the credit calculation. And in my example, the approach I'm taking in my example is I'm simply not including the rates for the exempt fund in the calculation. On the TS1, the net tax amount of the exempt funds is added to the percentage gross assessed value circuit breaker limit, and the total of those two amounts are shown as the maximum net tax bill. And so in explaining that to the taxpayer, because the taxpayer who knows, well, my limit's 1%, and that doesn't equal 1% of my gross value, well, hopefully the reason is that there are exempt funds, and the net tax bill of the exempt funds been added to that to show that the total of those is the limit that the net tax bill has to exceed. Either approach will get you to the same point, will get you to the same circuit breaker credit amount. So, in the next several slides, I'm going to walk through a circuit breaker credit calculation. And so I'm giving you some of the facts for this. In my example, I have a low at PTRC and seed at Homestead. And then I have these values here. And then my rate is 2.2536. And my referendum rate is 042. My replacement credit rate is the 37,536. And the seeded rate is the 04966. So in my calculation, I'm going to calculate the net tax rate subject to the circuit breaker limit. And so the net tax rate subject to the circuit breaker limit is going to equal the district rate minus the circuit breaker exempt funds and minus the property tax credits. So for the homestead property, the rate is the 2.256. The referendum rate is the 042. So we subtract that out and we get a district rate less the referendum rate of the 2.2116. Then we take that times the PTRC rate to get what portion of the tax rate is the replacement credit. And so when we take that 2.2116 times the 0.37536, we get 0.83. So that's the part of the rate that is the replacement credit, and we're going to subtract that out. We go through the same thing with the seeded, taking the 2.2116 minus the low at PTRC portion of the rate, because PTRC is subtracted out first, and then we take it times the seeded homestead rate, and to get the portion of the rate that is the seeded homestead, and that equals the 0.0686. So now our net tax rate for circuit breaker credit calculation equals 1.313. That's the total district rate minus the referendum rate minus the PTRC portion of the rate and minus the homestead credit portion of the rate. For the residential property portion of this tax bill, we find that the net tax rate for circuit breaker is 1.3816. We got there in basically the same way that we got to the net tax rate for homestead. The only difference here is there is no seeded homestead part of the rate to subtract out. And so that part is gone because for the net tax rate for circuit breaker for this property type is the district rate of the 2.2536 minus the referendum rate of the 0.042 minus the low at PTRC part of 0.83 to get that 1.3816. So the rate's different here. For the non-residential real property and personal property, the net rate for circuit breaker credit calculation is the same as the other, the 1.3816, because the calculations are all the same. There is no difference between the two property types when it comes to calculating the net tax rate amount. There is definitely a difference when we calculate the circuit breaker credit because the percentage of gross AV is different. Now, in counties that have the qualified res PTRC, you would have even another separate calculation going on for just that residential property, non-homestead residential property, because in that calculation, you would have included the subtraction of the qualified res PTRC, and so it adds another layer to the calculation for those counties that have that particular type of credit. I thought about including that in my example, but I thought we're running through enough numbers the way it is. So now we're going to calculate the circuit breaker credit amount. We've calculated what our net rate subject to circuit breaker is for each type, and so now we separate out the property and the net assessed value for the homestead property divided by 100 is $3,350. We take that times our net tax rate subject to circuit breaker of 1.313, and we get a net tax amount of $4,398.50. Now we want to see what is the limit, and the limit is the gross value, the $565,000 times 1%, or $5,650, and that is more than our net tax rate, so we have no circuit breaker credit here. The residential property and the long-term care property and agricultural land go through the same steps with the net assessed value for that property divided by 100 is 500. The net rate of the 1.3816 times that 500 gives us a net tax bill subject to circuit breaker of $690.80. Our gross value on that property was $50,000, and so times 2%, the limit is $1,000. There again, the limit's more than the net bill, so there is no circuit breaker. Non-residential, same steps. We get down to the bottom of that where we have the gross value on that property was $120,000 times 3%, and had $3,600 as the limit. The net tax amount subject to circuit breaker on this property type was $1,657.92. There again, the limit is more, so no circuit breaker. So this particular tax bill, there is no circuit breaker. But you say, wait a minute, Dan. That net tax rate subject to circuit breaker was 1.313, and the circuit breaker percentage is 1%. There should be circuit breaker because it's over 1. It's 1.31 compared to 1. But we went through the calculation, and there is no circuit breaker. And the reason there is no circuit breaker is because of this term I call the circuit breaker net assessed value threshold percentage. And what that percentage, or how that percentage is calculated, is we take the circuit breaker gross assessed value percentage, the 1, and we divide it by the net tax rate subject to circuit breaker, which in this case is the 1.313, and only properties that exceed that calculation are going to be properties, or wait a minute, let me back up. where only properties that have the net assessed value divided by the gross value, that percentage exceeds that circuit breaker threshold percentage. Only the ones that exceed that are going to have circuit breaker. So hopefully this slide will make that more clear. So in this example, the threshold percentage is equal to 0.76. That's the 1 divided by the 1.31. In my example, the net AV as a percentage of the gross AV is equal to 0.59 for the residential property. So the residential property's net assessed value was $335,000 and divided by 565,000. And that gives us 0.59. The 0.59 is less than the 0.76. So only properties where the net AV divided by the gross AV are greater than 0.76 will there be circuit breaker. Taxpayers still may think you're nuts. You try to tell them that, but it works. And so this may explain, and especially in counties where your net tax rate subject to circuit breaker, where that net tax rate is close to that circuit breaker percentage, then those counties are going to be cases where you're going to have properties that aren't going to get a circuit breaker because that threshold percentage is going to be very high. And so it's going to be very few properties that are going to exceed that. If you're a county where your net tax rate on homestead property is 1.1, chances are even though you're over the 1, chances are there won't be properties that have a circuit breaker because you're so close to the same. But if you're a county that has a net tax rate on homestead property that's, we're going to say, 2.5 or even 2, then you're going to have several properties that are going to be getting the circuit breaker because that threshold percentage is going to be low, and it won't take a lot. And we're going to look at another example here in a moment, but that can explain many times why there will be properties not receiving a circuit breaker credit, even though the rate is over that limit, that 1% or the 2% or 3%. So I'm going to look at another tax bill. We're going to use all the same values. We're going to use all the same rates, and this tax bill has all the same values. The taxing district rate is the same, and but the difference is that there is no referendum fund, there are no exempt funds, and there are no property tax credits. And we'll see what this same tax bill would be in a county where there were no credits and there wasn't a referendum fund. So the calculation of the net tax rate subject to circuit breaker credit becomes pretty simple. It's exactly equal to the taxing district rate because there's nothing to subtract out. There are no credits to subtract out. There's no referendum rate to subtract out. And so it is what it is. We'll skip on to the actual calculation because the net tax rate subject to circuit breaker is exactly the same for each of the 3 property types. And so we go through and we calculate the homestead property portion of this tax bill. The net assessed value divided by 100 is still the same, $3,350. The net tax rate subject to circuit breaker limit is different. It's simply the taxing district rate. So the calculation of the net tax bill, net tax amount is the 3,350 times the taxing district rate of 2.2536, or a net tax bill of $7,549.56. The circuit breaker limit is still the same, 1% of the gross, or the 5,650. Now we do have a circuit breaker credit amount. In this case, the residential property, we go through the calculations, and we find that the net tax bill does exceed the 2% limit, and so we have a circuit breaker credit amount of $126. We look at the non-residential part. Well, we still don't have a circuit breaker credit here because the net bill doesn't exceed the limit, and we wouldn't have expected it to exceed the limit because the tax rate itself is below $3. So the total circuit breaker credit for this particular tax bill is $2,026. That first bullet point is just stating what I stated a moment ago. The reason there is no circuit breaker credit for the non-residential property is because the total rate is less than 3. And then in this there is circuit breaker for a homestead property in the residential property because the net tax rate exceeds the circuit breaker percentage, and the net value as a percentage of the gross value exceeds my circuit breaker net assessed value threshold percentage. And we look at that in the next example, next slide, where for the homestead property, the circuit breaker net assessed value threshold percentage is equal to 44%. And for the residential property, it was equal to 89%. In our example, the homestead net value divided by the gross value is 59%, and that's greater than the 44%, so that's why there is a circuit breaker credit. And then for the residential property, the net and the gross are the same, so that's 100%. And obviously that exceeds 89%. So in this example, the gross values, the net assessed values were the same. The taxing district rate was the same. Total taxing district rate was the same. The difference being that there were property tax credits in the one example and not in the other. And the circuit breaker amounts in this case will represent lost property tax to the taxing units, whereas in the counties where they have the credits, there are no circuit breaker credit amounts and there is no circuit breaker revenue loss, and property tax is being shared, you might say, between income tax and property tax, and taxing to the taxing units, they are getting their full distribution. So that's one way to manage circuit breaker revenue loss, along with keeping property tax rates low. Property tax credits can and do come into play with managing circuit breakers sometimes. And with that, I think we have a break.